Hello, welcome everybody to Season for Exchange. My name is Emma Dunton. I'm the Programme Director for Season for Change. This event is called Sustainable Cities with Amahra Spence, Aranvir Gawera, and is chaired by my colleague Salome Wagane. Just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, sorry that we were a little bit delayed. It was just a slight technical hitch, but I think we're all okay now. So just a little bit of housekeeping. The conversation today will be recorded. Please use the Q&A function for any questions that you have throughout. If you have any technical difficulties, tech host Days Hale is on hand to help resolve them. So please use the chat function to flag any issues and select all panelists. For the captioning, at the bottom right hand corner of your screen, you will see a subtitles button next to the share screen. Please use this to view the captions. It'd be great if you wanted to join us on socials using hashtag Season for Change. Season for Exchange is a precursor to Season for Change, and this is our penultimate event of what has been a 3-week programme inspiring artists and arts professionals to learn, share knowledge and talk about climate action and climate justice. The project is led by Artsadmin and Julie's Bicyle and delivered in collaboration with partners nationwide and supported by the Arts Council England and the Paul Hamlyn Foundation. So that's enough of me, and I'm going to hand over to my colleague Salome.
Hello everyone, yes, so my name is Salome Wagane. I'm a writer, producer and programme manager here for Season for Change. Cities are dangerous, rebellious, static, subversive, sites of opportunity and division. They're contested places, but where the majority of people living on our planet currently reside. So as a programme, we felt it was important to devote a session here as part of Season for Exchange to thinking about climate justice from an urban perspective. I'm incredibly excited to be chairing this evening's discussion. I'll kick off with a few prompts for our speakers, but we'll leave time for about 15 minutes of questions from attendees, so please do send yours through. But first, introductions. So Amahra Spence is a cultural producer, artist and founder of MAIA. In 2013, she set up the organisation to support artists striving for justice through resource redistribution and building social infrastructure. MAIA are developing a series of spaces that redistribute the culture sector's hospitality spend to invest in systematically underinvested in communities. In 2020, Amahra established the Black Land and Spatial Justice Project, following a campaign which raised over £30,000. She was also invited to join England's first Land Commission, working with the Liverpool City Region Mayor to review and suggest uses for public land for community wealth building. Aranvir Gawera works within the planning team at City Council in the East Midlands. He helps write policies which set the direction for what his home city will look like in the future. His topics include climate change and sustainability, the natural environment and open spaces. Aaron is passionate about promoting participation in planning and encouraging more people to work in the built environment and public service sectors. He was recently appointed a non-executive director of public practice and the Town and Country Planning Association, and is an advisor to Women in Planning and the Planning Officers Society. So, esteemed panelists, I think you'll all agree. So yeah, let's just kick off. So this is a question for both of you really. How does your work and approach look to encourage the co-creation of cities? How do we increase a sense of engagement and ownership across different communities in where they live? Amahra, do you want to kick off?
Oh, such a small question to start with. I think if I can take it back a little bit, what I'm really interested in, like, I'll admit I'm a philosophy nerd. So when I was studying, you know, John Locke and philosophers like this, these people were like determined, they were deemed as like the father of empiricism, the father of liberalism. And they were the people who kind of decided that and helped us to configure this idea that land was a human right and a natural right. I think John Locke wrote about the fact that if you work on the land, you have the human right to own. But it's really interesting that at the time that he was writing and making his theories, he had direct investments in chattel slavery. He was one of the biggest investors in the slave trade in like around the 1690 period. So at the time that he was writing his work, he was both dehumanizing a section of people at the same time as elevating and talking about the rights to land. And so when, you know, we've developed this idea of land ownership from this really toxic history. And so it's something that we need to reckon with before we think about how do we co-create cities. We need to understand how we've even got to this point where we think that land is something to be owned, is entitled, but also then, you know, who is sort of the default in where that entitlement goes. I think so a lot of the work that we're doing is very much looking at how do you talk about the root causes, the root of injustice, the root in terms of how land has been divided, has been owned. Even the idea that land should be owned in the first place is, you know, an inherently sort of racialized and colonial idea. So a lot of our work is looking at the root of that, and then talking about how as artists might we reimagine the systems around, you know, how land is governed, organized, stewarded. How do we respond to that? How do we create safer spaces in our communities? Because we know that land is such a massive thing, and land injustice underpins lots of other injustices that we see because of this relationship to land and wealth. And the Black Land and Spatial Justice Project is really looking at how do we amplify the knowledge of people who are working in that space and have been for a long time. And I'll stop there before I get too excited.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably like to give my perspective as someone who's working in local government, and just trying to have an appreciation that actually the area that I work in the planning department, is defined by quite a rigid set of government legislation and national policy that actually does reduce the scope for how we can co-create cities. And I think in part it touches on what was just being said about the origins of kind of the way that we treat land, but for me, at least in my profession, the origins of the planning system, which actually has always favored private interests. And so when you think about the way that decisions are made and the way that, and the context that we sit in, actually landowners and developers, once a decision is made, they're the only ones that can really question whether we've made the right decision. And, you know, that same right isn't given to members of the public. And so when you start to move those decisions further upstream, you know, in the local plan making process, which is where I sit, actually it becomes dominated by a host of stakeholders who have a really strong and vested interest in the built environment, but they also have the resources to make sure that their voices are the main ones that are heard over the span of 5 to 10 years. And so I'm not saying that we aren't able to co-create cities, but I think what I'm trying to get across is that a large proportion of the decision making and the structures that define decision making is determined by the indirect forms of participation, like via elected officials. And so, you know, that in kind of when you're trying to shape cities, they have a lot of say in how we choose to represent the public interest. And a lot of that legislation and national policy context plays quite a strong role in the framework for how we might, for defining the scope of co-creation of cities on a local scale. And so, yeah, I think I can stop there. I can keep going about giving some examples of the way that we try and encourage participation in the local plan. And, you know, we've done really well in kind of digital inclusivity. But there are also other more recent opportunities like neighborhood planning. And that's where members of the community are able to produce their own local plan. And we do try and support those communities. But again, it's dominated by individuals who are time rich and have the resources to try and engage the community over the lifespan of, for example, 5 years.
That's really it's a really interesting provocation. I would love to know a little bit more about what those local plans would look like, and then I'll ping back to you, Amahra, because I know that some of the work that you're doing is embedded in that sort of practice as well.
Local. Sorry, go on.
No. We're going to be over polite now. I was just going to say, I'm really interested in what would it mean if, you know, artists were to reimagine what the planning system even looked like. We have lots of projects where we're trying to explore what this is, but also like how do we amplify the imagination and the perspectives of children, of young people within this, because there is this assumption, and it, you know, it stems from, you know, this history and this hierarchy, this imposed hierarchy. There's this assumption that says we are the experts and we know how planning is done. What I'm really interested in, how hip hop, for example, has given us the license to speak about planning. It's given us the license to speak about architecture, because if you think about hip hop as a social critique of its environment, if you think about the conditions through which hip hop was created in, and then you start to see that people have always had things to say about the way their neighborhoods and environments have been designed, how might you use those genres, whether it's, you know, grime has a really similar context as well, drill has a similar context. How could you use those genres to reimagine what planning, what neighborhoods, what architecture should be or could be? And how do you then, you know, resource that sort of approach in terms of saying you have ideas, you have master plans, you have a sort of vision for what things should be, and here's a language through which you can do that. And we've been exploring ways of doing this with children as young as 6 years old at MAIA. We've got a program called Beats, Rhymes and Cities, where we use sort of responsive and generative technology to create architectural forms that are hip hop responsive. So it's like young kids are creating their own architectures. They're designing cities from the architecture that they built. They're making plans, and they're developing systems for how, you know, neighborhoods are created and how things work together, and what social infrastructure should exist in those neighborhoods. And if kids as young as 6 can do this, you know, who have we been denying the opportunity and the access to have that knowledge?
So I think one of the critiques that we're making is of the planning system, which I think is rooted in an 80-year-old system. You know, when I mentioned before that we've got a framework that we work within, and the origins of that framework came about when we had a social movement just after the World Wars, and it aligned with the public health movement, the birth of the NHS, with the same movement that kind of came with the creation of the planning system. And I would agree that I think there's been, you know, at the heart of planning when it started, it was a technical process, but it was also, there was an art towards the discipline itself. And actually, when it came about, it was a civic movement. It was a social movement that had its ideas in placemaking in its entirety. And that included trying to engage with artists to understand that quality of shape of places. And I think the organization that I would perhaps draw the closest parallel to is the Town and Country Planning Association, who are actually trying to deal with this problem of reconnecting the arts with planning, because we do feel like there is a loss in that level of connection. And so I think, you know, if people are interested in trying to explore that connection further in terms of the relationship of arts and planning, you know, they've established a place network which tries to bring together planners and artists and anyone else with an interest in the value of arts and creativity, in actually trying to improve that planning process and have, I think, the conversation that you're trying to have, Amahra, but also show that, you know, arts and that level of concept has a really positive impact in creating our towns and cities. But, you know, I would also draw the attention towards their most recent provocation paper. So, you know, we're having this discussion because it's relevant, because they're talking about it. And actually the organization I'm talking about has a provocation paper where they hope to start that conversation about how we can put the passions and inspiration of the art practice back at the heart of the planning process. And I think, you know, and even in that study or that publication paper, they begin to recognize that actually the conversation between planners and artists have been happening at a really low level. But actually there's been growing concerns, like you rightly say, about the poor quality of new housing, the lack of trust between people and planners, and actually the decline in some instances of existing civic spaces, where actually they started by sparking new energy, or they really started on the base of the ideals of planning as an art. And I think, you know, that paper at least is designed to act as a provocation to hopefully feed into the organization's art strategy, which they can advocate to national government and local authorities, which really calls for an entirely new philosophy of planning based on, I think, what you're trying to encourage, which is civic art, to restore planning as a humane and maybe powerful force for enabling better lives.
100%. And, you know, I'm on the Land Commission with representatives from the TCPA, and hearing about this work is really exciting. I think what it comes down to partially for me is who holds the value then of what is then created through this amplification of the relationship between artists, planning and communities, neighborhoods. There has been a long history of, as you've identified, of you know, artists having something to say and to respond to in relation to placekeeping, placemaking, shaping, and all of the different forms. But essentially, so much of it comes down to, you know, artists can go into a space and generate heat and build amazing things. But if ultimately that is then going to be extracted by property developers, by those who have the resources, and taking that sort of surface level off, we're never going to get to the root of what justice actually looks like. But I think that report is a really interesting provocation. I definitely recommend that as well. Thank you.
And just moving on from that, I think something that has been at the heart of what Season for Change is about is around climate justice, and thinking about the ways in which these forms of power or access is shared and distributed. And you've just flagged, you know, the question around artists taking shape and having power in the shaping and planning and movement of cities. But I suppose there's often a question around culture washing with certain things, access to the unfair access to certain provisions. So next sort of prompt that I've got and question for you both is, how does the concept of justice, another just tiny concept, affect your priorities for space, land and planning? Aaron, do you want to start?
Thanks for giving me the easy question. I think for me, it's trying to understand what justice means. And I think it's fairness maybe in the process, in the way that you make decisions, but also fairness in the outcomes that are achieved. And I think that's fairness in terms of the socio-economic demographics of individuals, but also I think the climate implications that I think we are aware that, you know, there's a Venn diagram which combines those different issues. So in terms of the process, I think outside of planning, but within local governments, we have tried to make sure that we encourage more meaningful community engagement when we're making decisions. And I think the most recent and the most relevant example to this conversation was our approach towards the climate emergency. And so actually we recognize that climate change is a global issue, but one that local people really care and communities really care about. And actually when we're trying to find solutions and new ways of living, we're trying to do this for a global issue on a local scale. And so in terms of trying to create a more fair consultation approach, we changed the way that we had this conversation from a formal consultation to actually a conversation with the different communities across the city. And so as part of that, we had 2 climate assemblies, one of them for general city residents and actually one for young people. And that we invited from local schools. And actually in both of these sessions, we tried to have a range of individuals that were really representative of the communities that are in Leicester. But also we tried to follow an approach that was deliberative, that followed deliberative democracy, where actually we were allowing people to make informed decisions. And so part of that was informing them of the issues that we were going to discuss before they had arrived to that session, but also informing them of the discussion as it went along, so that they could genuinely participate in trying to co-create local solutions to the approach that we should take towards the climate emergency. But I think, I think I'll stop there now.
I want you to keep going. Go ahead. I think for us, we think about justice as like an iterative thing, and we think about it through the lens of like restorative justice and transformative justice. And I'll come back to that. To give an example of the sort of relationship that we've had to this, I guess. 4 years ago, I put out a sort of vision blog about what my utopia would look like. And I'd started to think about this idea for this artist-led hotel. And I was thinking about how, you know, for about 5 years prior, I'd been running MAIA and had been trying to find ways of inhabiting a space in a healthy way, in a just way, in a way that was not extractive, in a way that we could sustain ourselves and the work that we were doing, and therefore our communities that we work with. And we'd been trying to find a model that could support that. So the idea for the hotel came, and it was looking at, you know, redistributing the cultural sector's hospitality spend, because this myth that there is no money in the arts is ridiculous. There's a lot of money in the arts, but it's how investment flows, what we choose to invest in, where that value is held. So we said, if there's a mechanism or a bit of social infrastructure that we could design that could keep that circular, how then might we be able to inhabit space? I put out this blog post. Loads of developers, loads of financiers, investors, grant makers got in touch, and I said, you know, this is amazing. How about this building? Here's a 5-year lease. How about this opportunity? You could do a takeover for a year. And we're talking about justice. I don't know what kind of justice takes a year to solve. So we were like, we can't take a surface level opportunity if that's what we're striving for. So we ended up turning down opportunities. And this came back to Salome, what you said about culture washing, art washing. We also acknowledge that, you know, we have the possibility of also being complicit in those systems of harm if we choose to be. So our thing is we can't do that. So we had to say no to opportunities. As much as I'd love a hotel open yesterday, and it means we've been on a really long-term relationship and dialogue with property developers, trying to advocate for a long-term plan that can mean not only do we end up owning the building, a caveat to that is we know ownership is still a surface level sort of means to an end. That's not the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to get to a place of promoting and advocating for land stewardship. But we can only do that if we start here and create some sort of system and structure that means the community holds the value of us doing that. And that's taken a long time. And I speak about restorative and transformative justice because it comes back to this point about the inequity and the inequality in the first place in how we understand and see land, which sits underneath all of the, you know, it sits at the heart of all of these ideas around planning and built environment. It essentially is a harm. The entitlement that we have to a natural resource, which is land, which is earth, not only does it contribute and lead to the direct harms in relation to people, if we look at gentrification and displacement, if we look at the health outcomes of people who live in estates in southeast London, if we look at all of these sort of metrics, it's a direct harm. But on top of that, we're talking about resource depletion. We're talking about harm to the natural environment. We're talking about like the wildfires that have been taking over California, Australia for years. The escalation of that is in direct relationship to how we harm the environment because of our priorities in investing in private sector, private interests. And so it's like we can't talk about land justice without talking about the harm that we cause. And therefore, we need to not only repair that harm, but we need to understand the root causes of that harm in order to ensure that what we create isn't a surface level response to it. It is transforming the very initial conditions. And that's really what transformative justice is advocating for.
So just trying to apply that to a policy context, I think, I'll draw it back to another TC, Town and Country Planning Association publication, where they actually looked at London and the planning system in London, the local plans that people were producing, and trying to come through a framework of how you might create a just city, a more just city, holistically, but looking via the lens of the planning system. And they explored it in 16, but maybe I'll talk about 4 of them, and kind of how we might go about trying to create a more just city. And one of the first themes that they explored was actually making sure that the aims and the ambitions of planning, and it had an overarching commitment to promote equality and reduce socioeconomic exclusion. So I think when they were trying to think of solutions, they said, you need to embed it in the purpose of planning to make sure that when you're making decisions, there's a clear purpose. And planning in general lacks a clear purpose. I think it's been dominated by private sector interests with the need for more homes. And actually social inequality was removed 10 years ago from planning completely in terms of the frameworks that were allowed. So, when I'm trying to, no matter how much we try, there's national government does reduce both our agency and also our resources to maybe co-create or create more just cities on a local scale. And so what cities were advocating for was kind of embedding social justice in the purpose of planning. But I mean, they also mentioned, making sure we had more meaningful public participation, which I mentioned earlier. I think the way that they were trying to do it was through the statement of community involvement. So when we're producing a local plan, we need to produce a statement of community involvement, which sets out how we're going to engage with the community and actually encourage that diversity in views. But one of the other ones, I think, when you're trying to understand harm, I think, Amahra, from what you were mentioning earlier, was considering how the local plan policies that we produce that will shape the future of our city, how they affect different groups. And actually the way that we've been trying to do that is through equality impact assessment, where actually it looks at the policy that we're producing in a very iterative way, and it considers how the impact those policies might have on key groups, equality groups, and then trying to revise those policies in line with that impact assessment. And there's also a question of whether we continue to do that, or when any new development comes forward, or actually should you have an equalities impact assessment for development as they come in through the pipeline. And then finally, I think there was also the final theme was about trying to embed inclusion and equality within key policy areas themselves. So I think that's being able for us as a local government to support community initiatives, community-led initiatives like community housing or community stewardship or management or ownership of assets that really matter to communities. It could be a local club or a local play space, but it could also, for example, in relation to climate change, include localized forms of renewable energy generation. So I think there are steps that we can take, I think, to translate some of that just elements of adjustability practically into policy. But no matter how much we want to do it, I think there is national government who have for the last 10 years really taken several steps back in the tools that we can use to have a more equitable response in what we're trying to achieve.
I think the topic around embedding those principles of social justice and also constantly evaluating who is being affected feels really topical at the moment, because I know that a lot of people have been seeing responses to low traffic networks, for instance, in their neighbourhoods or neighbourhoods that they know of, and thinking about what the unexpected consequences might be of something that really most people would be in favour of. So I'm going to ask a slightly more practical question for you both now, which was, how did you end up working in this space? And then moving on from that, thinking about who is also working in urban planning and conception and who could be. So yeah, Amahra, do you want to, how did that start?
We'll see what comes out. When I was 8, I wrote a book. It had all these characters in it. This was like when I'd got my first computer. I promised there's meaning to this madness. I got my first computer in my home. It was like a revolutionary thing. Wrote this book, computer crashed, I lost it. I'd spent a year writing it. I was gutted. I've been confessing this lately. I think I'm trying to come to terms with this. I then became like a total nerd. So I would steal textbooks from school, and I would start to I made basically like a spreadsheet in my little textbook with all the data that I could remember about these characters that I'd built, that I'd designed, that I'd imagined. And I'd write like their names, their date of birth. I'd write where they lived, what their jobs were, how they got to work. Essentially I started to design like what the social infrastructure was that supported their day-to-day. Didn't have the vocabulary for it at 8, obs, but I'd realized that I had this preoccupation with world building from a really young age. So I became, an artist. I was really into storytelling. I was really interested in the dynamics and the relationships between people that inhabit those spaces. I became a musician, a playwright, and an artist, a multidisciplinary artist. And in that, essentially, in my day-to-day, I'm invested in building worlds. I'm invested in imagining worlds and thinking about what justice looks like for my characters. So it was always there. And my friend Amber and I, around that time where I really started to do more in my artistic practice, we came together and we were like, how do we support other artists to do what they love for a living, to build the worlds that they want to build? What would sustainability look like so that we could keep doing that for a long period of time? Because we know we can't be grant reliant if it means that when public funding disappears, we're going to disappear as well, because that's how it goes as a Black-led organisation. And so we'd been thinking about what space looked like, sort of like, ongoing, but only really in the last, say, 5 years or so have we been intentionally speaking about spatial justice and spatial practice. But it is from that sort of like really long and often a romanticized idea. I mean, I didn't have the vocabulary for this stuff, but when I started to realize that my influences, that my interests had things to say about planning and about architecture and the built environment, I realized I had lots of things to say about it as well. And as a answer to your second question, who is doing this work? I'm going to big up Resolve. I think Resolve might be in this call, hold tight Seth and Nikhil, because a few months ago, maybe, or maybe a few weeks ago, they talked about Friday, which is one of my all-time favorite films. If you haven't watched Friday, you should watch Friday. It's a classic. Friday, they were talking about Friday as a spatial practice film, and I was like, that's dope. Like, my references, my inspirations are spatial practice influences. So big up Resolve, big up Akil and Seth, and all of the people who are doing that work. And I'll probably send like a list of people that you should check out after this. But Andre Reed in Warsaw, who's working, he leads Kiondo. And the Black Females in Architecture group. I mean, stop me now. I'll keep going.
Hey, oh well, okay. If you stop, then you stop. But Aaron, do you wanna?
Amahra, it feels like you've been an urban planner since such a young age. I feel like, why haven't we convinced you to come over to this side?
I didn't know it was a thing. You know, we don't know that these things, that these things are opportunities, are possibilities, are job titles.
No, completely agree. And so actually, interestingly, I had a reverse experience and I know that you loved planning but never became a planner. I had no idea what planning was, and I ended up becoming a planner. And actually, I started by studying physics at university. But at the same time, I did some international development work in Nepal and Tanzania. And I really realized that I wanted a career that would help people, but also solve really complex problems that kind of solve or improve people's lives, but also, you know, the state of our planet. And so I ended up studying urban planning in London. But again, even then, when I was leaving university, I intended to go and work in a developing country. But then I also started to appreciate that actually those same communities were in the city that I grew up in. And so I kind of made a very conscious decision to come back to my home city and work in the planning policy team here in local government. And so that's kind of how I arrived here. But for those that are already in the industry, like professionals, because I think there is a dichotomy between the public sector and the private sector, and organizations like Public Practice which is a social enterprise that allows people to change their career paths from the private sector into the public sector, and really appreciate that culture change when you're trying to shape the built environment, but in the interest of the public. And so I think that seems to be a really exciting opportunity to encourage more people to arrive in this space who are experienced professionals. But actually, one of the passions that I have is getting more young people involved in understanding what is happening in the built environment around them, but also how they can get involved. And so I've been trying to partner with local geography teachers, for example, to embed place shaping in their curriculum. And so giving them case studies about what's happening in Leicester, but also giving them exposure to some of the career paths like planning, like transport development, that they could then go on and consider moving forward. And I think, you know, when I look back to one of the memories that I have about planning, even though I didn't know about planning, was actually when the local council gave my school, and in particular myself, an opportunity to shape a local park. And it was a really easy way for them. You know, I know the decision, I didn't play a really big part in making that decision, but I still feel like I have ownership over that space up until this day, because I played a little part in it when I was very young. And actually and I continue to have that sense of ownership over that little play part, but also my city moving forward. And so I think when I'm thinking about how I got here and how to encourage others, I am trying, as a passion of mine, to encourage more young people from diverse communities to encourage to be engaged in this, either as a profession, but also as an opportunity to participate in decision making more generally.
It's I was like particularly struck by the fact that yeah, I feel as though most people don't know that urban planning exists, right? But a lot of people, as I've mentioned, live in these places, and so it's thinking about who has the tools to know about these things. And yet, actually, when you look at it could be a film like Friday. One of my housemates is watching Brooklyn Nine-Nine at the moment, and there's an episode where one of the characters says that his favorite character in Sex and the City is the city of New York. And I've always been drawn to like the concept of place, and where, because it completely alters something. I remember hearing, especially this year, people talking about how, for instance, something like I May Destroy You is a particularly good depiction of the city that I'm from and live in. And just yesterday I was listening to a podcast, and they were talking about a film that's on Netflix, and they said, oh, it's great because it's about a different sort of London. I thought it was very interesting, because actually maybe it wasn't a different sort of London, it just wasn't yours or your city or your conception of things. So yeah, I'm pleased that there are initiatives that are looking to think about who could be getting further involved. So if we talk kind of, we can go a bit back, I suppose. And the reason I invited Amahra to this is because we met at, we got a British Council bursary, I think in 2017, to go to IUTM, which is every 6 months sort of meeting mainly in a European city, and we were in Porto. And the theme for that conference, that kind of session, was other centres. So they deliberately, was taking place in Porto as opposed to Lisbon, and the sessions had a focus on the responsibility and duties that performing arts workers, as being performing arts, had to the environments they make work in. And this year has seen dramatic changes in the way many people, not all, but many people work and live, with city centres in particular bearing the brunt of lockdown and the shutdown of industries, office spaces, and so on. Something that people often talk about is things being overly centric, especially in this country. The focus of where we are is quite concentrated. How can we decentralise our centres and our cities further?
I live in Birmingham. I'm from Birmingham. Anybody? I'm from Birmingham, which, in the UK context, it's a heavily centralised city. It doesn't get the investment, the resources, the this, that, the other that London has. Instead, what it has is this really insular sort of centralised city, and that manifests in lots of ways, but everybody sees it really clearly in public transport. And this is another reason why I'm really interested in urban planning, but I'm writing a blog article at the moment that is why the man them should be planners. When I was young, like 15 or so, maybe like 14, 15 years old, there was a race riot that happened in my neighbourhood of Handsworth, and it was massive. Lives were lost. It was really horrendous. And for a long time, what that meant was a lot of people could not catch certain buses. And how that manifested is people were having to walk miles to get to wherever they needed to get to. And every single bus had to get to the city centre before it could go to the other side of Birmingham. So I was really interested in this idea, what would it mean if the man them started, designing how public infrastructure, how public transport works? Because, those are the things that people have loads of ideas about. I was talking to my friend the other day. I call him a hood scholar. He's not an academic by traditional sense, but he knows so many things about so many things. And he was like, yeah, well, so I couldn't have caught the 16 bus because it took me here, there and everywhere, and I wasn't allowed. So I'm really interested in the thoughts and perspectives that people have from outside of these industries. Centralization to me, Birmingham has, I think, one of, if not the largest authority in Europe. It's ridiculous comparatively, given the scale of it. So I'm all for devolving government. I'm all for these things, but what we're really talking about is distributing power. Resourcing people where they are. People should be able to design and develop their own infrastructure, and it often feels that there are all of these layers of complexity. Policy is such a difficult thing. Being able to speak to your local council, apparently where I live, is a really impossible thing, and it feels as though it's been designed that way intentionally. That's how you maintain status quo. We've seen it with Brexit, we've seen it with lots of things. Add layers of faff and make the ordinary folk think that they haven't got a clue what's going on here, and you can slip some things under the net. To me, this idea of decentralizing is to do with everything. It's to do with infrastructure, it's to do with power and resources, it's to do with where we put energy, and it's also about how do you amplify the things that happen within neighborhoods. This belief that this belief that like inner city communities where I live haven't got ideas or visions or can't mobilize quick enough to compete with the pace of the private sector, it's nonsense. Like there are active blockers to ensuring that people can build the things that they want to build. So I'm like, how do you get the people who have the most passion, the most care, the most love about a place, how do you connect them with the resources needed to make the change happen? And me, like, we can knock the doors of our local councils, we can knock the doors of the authorities that be as much as we want. Some will budge, some won't. I'm a hustler, like I roll with hustlers, people that knock shit down, and get stuff done and work out the mechanisms and the policies afterwards. I'm all for squatters, I'm all for takeovers, I'm all for like guerrilla everything. Just do it and see what happens, because the only way to like make change sometimes is to force it and see what heat attracts. Hopefully no moths and parasites.
I think if I'm just going to add on to that, I think it's interesting that actually national government have proposed quite significant reforms to the way that we plan cities and actually the planning system. And that actually goes the opposite, I think, way to the what people in this conversation want, because it actually centralizes decision making even further. So it removes a lot of the decision making power of local governments. But actually, I think one of the examples where people can have direct participation, at least in planning, is through a planning application where you can accept it, you can use it, you can comment on what's happening. The government is proposing to remove that entirely and have all of those decisions made when you're producing a local plan, which is 3 or 4, which means that you don't know what the next door will look like because you made a decision about that 3 to 5 years before. But that's all in the framework of what national government has set. So in terms of I think if there is an aspiration to decentralize, the reforms at least are going in the opposite direction, where they are trying to centralize and push decision making further upstream. I think in terms of guerrilla tactics, I think at least in the city where I live in, we have tried during this situation and the recent events to do more pilot projects to try and encourage more sustainable transport for individuals and have those pop-up cycle lanes, particularly to what we know as communities that maybe find it more difficult to reach or to come into the city centre, and seeing what works and what doesn't work. So I think we're moving into a kind of a transition phase where we are more open to trying things out and failing, but it takes a very active and clear leadership from a local level. And so I think, with the local government that I have, and the city mayor and the role that he plays, I think he's really passionate about trying to make Leicester a better place. And I think that translates into the way that we work and the decisions that we make and some of the projects that we test.
Amazing. This has already been such a rich conversation, and I'm just going to open it up to the rest of everybody who's participating. So if you've got any other questions, do put it in the Q&A section. I'm also going to be rifling through the chat as well. But to start off, I've got a question from Zola, who's asking Amahra, have you collaborated in the past with your borough enterprise department for accessing additional tools, resources, local access for your climate change or justice, and building a stronger frontline partnership?
Meaty question. So unfortunately, I wish we had boroughs, first of all. Like, I really wish Birmingham had boroughs, because the size of it, we should freaking have boroughs. And that would help so much in terms of the administration, the ways in which, we look at the work that some of our friends in London have been able to do, because there is someone directly in the borough administration who they can go to or build a relationship with, or it's just much easier when there's that proximity there. We don't have it. So we've tried to build alliances, relationships with our city council, which is frankly too big to function, for years, to no avail or to very little avail. We've had some sort of backing from our local enterprise partnership, like backing in principle, which is they sort of like talk about us where we ask them to talk about us, and they sort of like big up the work we do, but it hasn't really translated into any tangible action. So we work with like the communities, the networks, the ecosystem that we build with. We talk a lot about interdependence. We acknowledge that, you know, we can't do what we do unless everyone around us is thriving and able to do what they do really well. And that means, you know, the young guy down the road who through, you know, the pandemic has set up a food business, through to the local nursery manager who has been nurturing and raising young Black children in particular, and because, you know, we want to start working with children from a really young age in terms of understanding what's possible in our neighborhoods, through to, you know, working with national networks, national funders, national partners, and everything in between. We're just doing what we can, man. Doing what we can. But I wish we had boroughs.
Yeah, that does sound like a sensible plan. Maybe we can lobby for that. More boroughs, definitely. Okay, so the next question is from Lucy Carruthers. Thank you for such an interesting conversation. It's all down to both of you. Could you see planning laws change to ensure all new developments are designed to consider and adapt to sea level rise and flooding, as well as to mitigate? Aaron.
I would hope to see that change. Do I actually see it? No. I think we've had 10 years of deregulation and the reduction in the quality of placemaking because, so I don't know how many of the conversation would know about permitted development rights, but it's where the government automatically give permission for some types of development, like changing an office block into housing. And that's led to flats the sizes of a car park. So, you know, the legislation has gone in the direction where it's not creating good quality outcomes for individuals, let alone good quality resilient outcomes to help us adapt to climate change. So there have been some steps, I think, in the reform in terms of rhetoric to try and introduce those minimum standards. And I think the TCPA are campaigning constantly to make sure that we have those minimum standards in place in legislation, so that, you know, they've got a Healthy Homes Act, where they believe that there should be a minimum standard that produces a healthy home, which is also resilient to climate change and flood risk. And that's why I think I'm part of those types of organizations. That's why I think I'm part of as trustee of the TCPA, because it gives a platform to advocate for those legislative changes, which just aren't happening unless key interest groups are passionate and advocate and campaign to the government to change the way that they're doing what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. And a final question before we kind of wrap up is, it's a bit of a combination of questions. It's from Malika from the Bear Project. Who wants to ask about how you transition from more formal land ownership to community-owned spaces. Can there even be just ownership of land? And how can we include non-human voices too?
I really hope that we move beyond the idea that ownership of land is the ultimate goal. And particularly, like, I'm really interested in conversations around rewilding. I'm really interested in conversations that are around sort of land stewardship. I'm very inspired by sort of Indigenous scholars. If I can point to the work of like Dr. Kelsey Leonard, who talks about sort of water sovereignty and land sovereignty. Like, those are the conversations that you know, that's where we should be getting to in the very near future, because this is about the climate crisis here and now, just as much as it is about racial injustice and every other kind of social injustice. And I think this is why I really wanted to talk about transformative justice, because to me, I don't think that you can have just ownership of land. I think you can find more collaborative, more collective, community, maybe slightly regenerative approaches to owning land. That is about the sort of like collective holding on to value. But if that isn't going directly back to, you know, trying to push towards that sovereignty, pushing towards rewilding and all those things, that's not justice.
I think I'd also say there's a value that's placed on good planning. And I think it depends on how we extract that value of placemaking. And actually right now, a lot of it is determined by conversations between developers when they make and the council when they make a decision. And it's favoured towards private interests, and that added value of good planning almost always goes to the landowner or the developer. So if you really want to encourage or extract the value of good planning and make sure it works in the public interest, whether it's for more affordable homes or for more community assets or for community-led infrastructure, I think it's about trying to change the ways that we extract that value. So for example, every time you pay stamp duty tax, actually that's a tax that's money that you're paying for a house. But imagine if you ring fence that money so that it went towards a community asset. And same with, for example, capital gains tax. And actually, capital gains tax is the value that increases of your home over time without you doing anything towards it. So is it fair that the person who's in that house gets to keep all of that land value? So I know, Amahra, you don't really like the principle of home ownership, but actually even when you transfer home ownership from one to the other, if you accept that, in this country, home ownership and ownership of land is quite a big aspiration for a lot of individuals, then actually how do we reimagine home ownership so that even in those transactions, we can extract the value of good planning and perhaps some strong elements of private interest and transform it in a way that goes towards the public good. And I think there are interventions that we can do, but again, it requires a reimagination of being and a confidence and a social movement to say, no, we want planning in the public interest. We don't want the finance or the value of good planning always going to a select few individuals. We believe that there's a different way to have a civic society. And so I think that's what, there are some steps there.
And I think that would be an incredible means to an end.
Yeah, and just following on from that, there's often, especially when you look to other countries, and even in the past, you look at things like housing co-ops and the relationship that cooperative communities and groups might have in terms of thinking about ownership beyond just like the contract between one person or a sort of nuclear family unit and their home and their land. I'm going to finish with a comment from Deborah, who so her hope is that urbanism and accessibility of place doesn't become too dope. Social justice needs to reach the whole community and not just those who can afford to live in dope places, which I feel, yeah, completely. And with that, I would just like to say thank you so much to both Amahra, Aranvir, to Tech Coast Days, and to Andrew who's been captioning. This has been the penultimate event for Season for Change, as Emma mentioned at the top. We've just got one final thing, and that is the Creative Green Awards ceremony that we are doing with Julie's Bicyle tomorrow afternoon. So do come along if that's for you. But in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful evening. And I'm going to be, sitting a lot, thinking about all sorts of things. Thank you so much.